Good morning and welcome to the launch of the Road Ahead 2024. I'm Nick, the Networks and Engagement Manager here at NCVO, and it's great to see so many of you joining us online. So the Road Ahead is our annual report on the changing landscape for NCVO members and voluntary sector organisations. It's been developed using a PESTEL analysis where we aim to identify, explore and help explain the external forces, issues and trends that are shaping our sector, helping you to understand how these changes may impact your work and your organisation in the coming year. In just a moment, I'll hand over to my colleague Rebecca to guide us through this year's Road Ahead. But before I do that, there's just a couple of housekeeping points that I wanted to note. So on this slide, we have images that represent different parts of housekeeping, which I'll talk through now. So closed captions have been enabled for today's event, and you can turn these on or off by clicking on the CC icon in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. To help with accessibility, the slides for today's event have just been shared in the chat as a PDF. So if it would help, you can download these to your computer to zoom in and out of the slides as we go along. Everyone today has joined in view-only mode, so this means your cameras and your microphones are automatically turned off so you can sit back and relax. Today's session is being recorded, but as you're in view-only mode, you won't appear on screen. Do use the chat to share your comments as we go along, but if this becomes distracting, as it often can, you can click on the chat icon and close the chat window. For any questions you'd like to put to our speakers today about the road ahead, please click on the Q&A button in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen and submit your questions for us there. And finally, if you're tweeting about the road ahead, please do remember to use the hashtag road ahead and tag us at NCVO. So onto the agenda, which lists our speakers and the order of the event on screen now. So in just a moment, I'll be handing over to Rebecca Young, NCVO's Head of Policy, Research and Campaigns, who will provide an overview of our predictions in the Road Ahead 2024. We're delighted that we'll then be joined by three guest speakers from across the sector who have kindly agreed to join the event and offer their reflections on our predictions. So today we'll be joined by Alexis Kalaji, Executive Director for Locality and Impact at Stroke Association. Next, we have Jack Bastian, Chief Education Officer at Diversity Role Models. And finally, Dan Such, Director of From Cast. After our guest speakers, we'll have time for a Q&A facilitated by Rebecca, where Alexis, Jack and Dan will be joined by Sam Cadente from NCVO's policy team. And just a reminder, if you do have questions, please submit them via the Q&A function, and please don't add them to the chat as they are likely to get lost. So with a packed agenda, let's get stuck into the Road Ahead 2024. And to introduce it, I'm pleased to hand over to my colleague, Rebecca.
Thanks, Nick. So last year, the combined threats of declining income, increased costs and rising service demand created a cost of giving crisis across our sector. Coming so soon after the pandemic, this crisis has meant that so many in our sector have not been able to look beyond keeping their doors open. And we are expecting another year of considerable change and challenge for our sector and society. As we look at the road ahead in 2024, we can see that the election brings uncertainty, tough times are set to continue, and there are big shifts for charities to adapt to. So what is our Road Ahead publication? The Road Ahead is our analysis of the changing environment for anyone working or volunteering in the sector. We identify and explain forces and trends that are shaping the sector and likely to have an impact. We use a simple PESTEL framework to highlight the key drivers across 6 areas. These are political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal. We use a wide range of sources to draft this report, from official statistics to the latest economic forecasts, as well as calling on the expertise of colleagues. We focus on general trends rather than subsector issues. And this year, we've included more ideas, tips, and tools for you to use in the year ahead. Each section has a stay ahead section listing kind of guidance and key questions for you to consider. We look at the opportunities and the challenges. We include what we know will happen, as well as what we anticipate to happen. And as ever, this is only a starting point. There'll be lots of other issues and questions that could be more specific to your organisation. And of course, the environment changes throughout the year. Today, I will try to pull out some of the key points across these 6 areas. Starting with the political drivers. So you'll all be aware that a general election is due. Parliament will dissolve no later than December 2024, with the latest possible date for an election being 28th of January 2025. There is ongoing speculation about when the Prime Minister will call the election. Autumn 2024 is seen as the most likely date, but this isn't guaranteed. Organisations will want to have a plan in place just in case an election is called earlier, and organisations will need to be flexible and adaptable. Charities will also need to follow electoral and charity law. You should consider whether an election could impact whether you want to increase your campaigning activity or not. Organisations need to make sure they know the rules on campaigning, and this will help you to campaign with confidence. This is the first election under the Electoral Commission's new Code of Practice, and organisations will also need to consider rules on non-party campaigning. We really encourage you to look at the guidance on our website that includes more detail about these things. This is also the first general election held under the Elections Act. This requires voters to show ID when they attend a polling station, and we know that many across our sector are concerned about the barriers this will create for disabled people, for people from global majority communities, younger people, and those who are unemployed. Charities will also want to manage risks online. Social media can be tough for organisations to navigate, particularly when speaking out on issues that attract disagreement. And we think there could be increased scrutiny of what charities say this year. It's worth looking at the Charity Commission's guidance on social media, and if you are speaking out, think about making sure you have leadership buy-in in your organisation, you have a plan for what sort of response you might get, and you have a social media policy in place. There are some key considerations if you're planning political engagement this year. So Labour have been ahead in the opinion polls since October 2022. So many organisations are looking to strengthen their connection, but we can never predict who will win an election. And it's important to engage right across the political spectrum. Charities need to be independent of political parties. It's also worth thinking about engaging new MPs. So there could be over 100 new MPs entering Parliament after the election, and you may want to consider building these relationships into 2025. We also have mayoral and council elections coming up in May. So a tough economic climate continues. Inflation remains high, so prices remain high. We know that organisations have seen their operating costs spiral in recent years. And economists expect the inflation rate, the pace at which prices are rising, to remain high. This means that prices will rise, although perhaps not as quickly as before. And even if the rate of inflation lowers, higher prices are here to stay. Sustained inflation also means organisations are likely to exceed certain thresholds, and this has an impact on administration and cost. High inflation also weakens the value of income because that income can't buy as much as it did before. And we've heard from our members over the past year how grants and contracts have not been uplifted to cover the true cost of delivery. Interest rates are unlikely to fall significantly this year. The Bank of England's main tool to bring down inflation is to increase interest rates. And this makes borrowing money more expensive. Organisations with loans or mortgages will be feeling the squeeze, and those looking to borrow may be waiting for interest rates to come down. There is also a knock-on impact on organisations renting space with rising office rental costs. And while these economic changes are hitting organisational costs, the people we seek to serve are also impacted. We expect to see continued high numbers of people seeking support from charities as the cost of living rises faster than any benefits increases. And with stricter benefit sanctions on the horizon, many in our sector are concerned about the people they support. Local authorities are also under a huge amount of pressure. Almost 1 in 5 council leaders in England think it is very or fairly likely they will need to issue a Section 114 notice. This notice signals that they are struggling financially and can't cover costs. If it's issued, an authority must bring its spending back in line with income, and this could mean cutting spending or raising council tax. We've already seen how this has impacted voluntary sector grants and contracts. And finally, public fundraising is likely to be challenging. Donations make up 47% of the voluntary sector's income. However, there's a long-running trend of a shrinking donor base. In this climate, it's no wonder that people are struggling with the cost of living. While the crisis began in 2021, it remains a central issue. 87% of adults state that the cost of living is the most important issue facing the UK today. And a range of well-being indicators paint a very bleak picture. Satisfaction with health is in decline, child poverty is rising, food bank use is increasing, and improvements in life expectancy rates have stalled or worsened in some areas. Charities are still facing rising demand as a result. This crisis is having a profound impact across society, but we know there are also other forces at play. People continue to give their time to make a difference, but we know that levels of formal volunteering have declined since 2020, 2021, and they remain well below pre-pandemic levels, although the rate of decline has slowed. And we know that rates of formal volunteering are lower in more deprived areas. Access to and experience of volunteering is not equal. Many charities are struggling to find volunteers and retain them. And we know that many across our sector are already embracing and experimenting with new approaches to engage people, particularly looking at more flexible volunteering opportunities. And tough new migration measures will impact charity staff and their ability to deliver. The government has announced plans to raise the earning threshold for overseas workers, gradually rising by nearly 50%. There will also be increasing costs of healthcare and reviewing visas for graduates. We'll also see a restriction on migration for those working in health and social care. We know that this will be tough for charities, particularly those already experiencing workforce challenges. And organisations should consider how these changes may impact their staff from overseas, including if they are unable to have a partner or family with them. Technology continues to shape how we live, work, and interact. The development of artificial intelligence will continue at pace. And the way machines perform tasks normally performed by humans and learn from data was the big story in 2023. From facial recognition software and products used by charities every day, AI will be increasingly prevalent in our work and interactions online. Some charities are already pioneering how to integrate AI into their services. And last year's Charity Digital Skills Report found that 3 out of 4 charities strongly agree that AI is relevant to their organisation and could transform the way they work. This year, we think we could see light touch regulation of AI. The government have been looking at what regulation or legal change is needed, and they've set some key principles and expectations, and they expect particular regulators to adapt to these. We think the Charity Commission and other regulators will grapple with these requirements in the year ahead. Organisations also need to think about how they manage escalating cybersecurity risk. The National Cybersecurity Centre has warned of an increasing cybersecurity threat across the country. In August 2023, they received 64% increase in the number of attacks reported, and voluntary organisations are particularly at risk. Some of these risks are a particular concern for organisations developing apps. In October of last year, the government produced an updated code of practice for app developers with minimum security and privacy requirements. The government have set an expectation that app developers, including charities, implement the code by June 2024. Misinformation and the risk of deepfake technology are also a concern. It's becoming easier to use AI and deep learning techniques to create fake content showing people doing or saying things that they never did. At a time of polarisation, with charities caught up in the political crossfire, There's an increasing risk that bad actors use this technology to damage the reputation of charities or leaders in those organisations. It is important to make sure that you have the right systems and training in place to protect your organisation and the people you work with. Our environment is changing at an alarming pace. Extreme weather will impact how we achieve our missions, with more organisations called on to support emergency resilience and response. Charities need to build their resilience to climate change, and this is not an issue for the future. Across the world and in the UK, climate change risks are being realised, and we can see this in extreme temperature changes, floods and storms. Last year was the warmest year on record. And at the end of last year, the National Audit Office highlighted that these events are bringing significant costs, including to charities. So charities need to consider how their communities and work will be impacted and plan to adapt. Polling suggests that 77% of Britons think that climate change is a serious global threat, but the government is taking a slower path to net zero. Many analysts believe this will result in more fossil fuel emissions and faster and more severe global warming. While the pace has changed, the UK still has a net zero legal obligation, and there is a trend towards decarbonisation. All organisations will need to consider how they move to net zero. This could include a number of different considerations. It could be managing property, reducing waste, or minimising carbon in your digital footprint. We know, particularly from the last year, that charities have been struggling with energy costs, particularly those operating out of energy inefficient buildings. And there are new rules for landlords of commercial premises to meet minimum energy performance standards. These standards were introduced in April 2023, but enforcement has been minimal, and it's expected that local authorities will start to act in the year ahead. And as risk of droughts rises, water bills will also rise too. The National Infrastructure Commission says that there's a 1 in 4 chance of severe drought by 2050. This changes how we manage our water, and that comes with an increased cost. Water companies have submitted plans to the regulator to raise bills by an average of 35% between now and 2030, and a final decision will be made later this year. Finally, it's worth considering your investments. We can make a difference to our environment, and charities are increasingly supporting this by divesting from fossil fuels. And in 2023, we launched the Fueling Positive Change campaign to support charities with this decision. And finally, we come to the legal environment. So first of all, we can expect greater regulation from Companies House and a change at the Charity Commission. So most charities are legally companies limited by guarantee with charitable status. As well as being regulated by the Charity Commission, they are registered with Companies House. This means charity trustees are also directors under company law. Legal changes to how Companies House registers and expects information from companies will come into force this year. And in addition, the Charity Commission will see David Holdsworth take over as Chief Executive, and there will be a new strategic plan for this year. It's important to check online safety services follow new safety laws. Following years of discussion, 2023 saw the Online Safety Act passed. While there's been a focus on big tech, many of the new duties will impact voluntary organisations. There is a new legal framework and regulation for certain internet services and digital communications. Ofcom has published a roadmap to regulation with duties around illegal harm and child protection, and these are big priorities in 2024. There will also be new laws coming into place. There will be lots of focus on new legislation that could be passed by a new government, but there are also legal changes to consider this year. So the Procurement Act changes how public bodies buy goods and services from companies and charities. And these rules are likely to commence from October 2024. There will also be new criminal liability for organisations for fraud and for employees needing to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment. The past few years have seen a growth in restrictions on the right to protest, and this year we expect to see the Serious Disruption Prevention Order come into force. And in the years ahead, we expect a new duty on public premises to mitigate the threat from terrorism. This is particularly through the Protect Duty, which is also known as Martin's Law. And finally, there are changes to employees' duties, from changes to holiday pay to new rights for carers and those on maternity leave. And we urge you to read the full report for more details about these. I'll pass back to Nick.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that overview of this is kind of Road Ahead. And my colleague Chanel has posted a link to the Road Ahead publication that is kind of live on our website now. And I'm sure many of you kind of received an email kind of about the publication from our CEO, Sarah Vibert, this morning. But we can now kind of move on to the next part of today's event. And so you've kind of heard our predictions, and now it's time to get some views and reflections from colleagues across the sector. So for each of our guest speakers, they have kindly provided some bullet point summaries of their reflections, which will be on screen as they are talking. But for our first guest speaker, it's Alexis Kalaji, the Executive Director for Locality and Impact at Stroke Association. The Stroke Association are a charity that supports people to rebuild their lives after a stroke. They provide specialist support, they fund critical research, and they campaign to make sure that people affected by stroke get the very best care and support to rebuild their lives. So for our first guest reflection, it's over to you, Alexis.
Thanks so much, Nick. As Nick said, I'm Alexis Kalaji, Executive Director of Locality Impact at the Stroke Association. I oversee 10 locality teams that work across service delivery, influencing, and community engagement. I'm really delighted to be here speaking at this event because I'm really passionate about the voluntary sector, having worked in the sector for nearly 15 years. There's absolutely loads that resonated with me out of the report, but I'm going to focus in briefly on 5 themes that are most relevant to our work at the Stroke Association. So first up, we view the general election as a really important opportunity to increase the political profile of stroke. Despite the scale of stroke, it's the 4th or 5th biggest killer, depending on where you live in the UK. And the burden, it costs about £26 billion every year to NHS, social care, and the wider economy. Its profile and therefore the attention paid to it is not at the level that it needs to be, which is why one of our 2 strategic goals as an organization is to make stroke a priority. So we're currently planning our general election activity with one of the key elements being a creation of a value proposition about how the Stroke Association can support all political parties in tackling stroke at the highest level. So the messages around kind of reinforcing the value and skill of the charity sector really resonated with me from the report. Obtaining cut-through in a crowded environment is going to be really challenging, so we're thinking about how best we deploy our limited capacity to really cut through. We're also planning an awareness campaign, which we hope will help increase the public profile of stroke as a condition, so we're working to make sure that those 2 pieces of work are mutually beneficial of each other. The timing of the general election is of a concern to us too. If it is autumn as predicted, that's a really busy time for our locality teams, renewing and negotiating local service contracts and campaigning against those that are at threat at a time when the national campaigns team will be really focused on the election. So that's going to be a tricky time for us. It's a pretty big understatement to say the external environment feels really tough at the moment. Wider NHS pressures, the cost of living crisis, et cetera. They've been affecting stroke survivors for a few years now. This, of course, has a huge personal impact to anyone who's affected by a stroke, but the recession has wider implications too, because inequality and stroke are linked. People in more deprived areas have strokes on average 7 years younger. They're often more severe. Because they're younger, they're more likely to be working. They're less likely to have financial cushion on which to fall back on, and therefore much more likely to be affected by the reduction in income that comes with suddenly having a really severe disability. So we're seeing people come to us in much higher states of need. Case complexity is up. The amount of time our local coordinators spend with each person is increased. Applications for our hardship grants are up. And at the same time, there are fewer local charities and support services to refer people on to for non-stroke support, housing, benefits, fewer local grant providers, or grant providers that have significantly tightened their eligibility criteria. So our coordinators are spending a lot longer searching for local sources of support or supporting people in new ways. And unfortunately, this has a knock-on effect, which means we have less time available to support new stroke survivors. So our reach is down. And that's despite setting ourselves an ambition of trying to be there for every single person who leaves hospital after having a stroke. At the Stroke Association, we took really bold steps during the pandemic to kind of secure ourselves financially. So we moved away from our offices. We're fully remote. That saved us £2 million a year. We redesigned our operating model to make further savings to our cost base. And kind of looking over the last few years, our contract and legacy income, which are our two biggest sources, have grown. So our current financial position is strong. However, despite that, we are absolutely still seeing an impact of the cost of living, cost of giving crisis, and specifically tighter public sector finances. We're seeing far more services under threat this year than we have previously. Our biggest losses, both this year and last year, have been with local authorities. That's 20% of our contracts overall, but in some localities, it's up to 50%. So the fact that so many local authorities are kind of preparing bankruptcy notices is of real concern to us. Their budget situation has been poor for a long time, as many people know. So in some areas, we're refighting campaigns against service cuts that we have previously fought and won. So they're spending a lot of time just defending the status quo of our services, which does beg a question of, is there a walk-away point for local authorities as a potential funder for our services? We're also seeing more NHS-funded services under threat for the first time as a result of ICBs being in negative budgets in some areas. We're also seeing tighter contract margins than ever before, too. We've long been in a position where we've had contract rollovers year on year that don't take account of uplifts. But given kind of high inflation and our decision to raise staff salaries by 5% each year over the past 2 years, effectively all we've done is eat into our own contract margin, which kind of didn't cover the full cost of service delivery anyway. We have confirmed at the executive team that we want to put mission before income. That's the right thing to do. But there is a very real cutoff point where that's no longer financially viable. And we know that in the long term, subsidizing service contracts isn't great for the quality of service, and it's not great for the charity sector at large. Yet, on the other hand, we know walking away from service provision where there's no alternative provider for stroke survivors doesn't feel great either. So there's lots of really complex kind of knotty questions that we're working through around that at the moment. So I think this really highlights the importance of the NCVO's campaign on adequate funding of services, and we really, really support and welcome that campaign. Like many charities, staff costs are our biggest expense. We recognize we can't match pay increases with inflation, so we've worked to kind of increase staff motivation and engagement other ways. So we have a really big focus on flexible working, well-being, mental health, and bringing in more progressive working practices to increase trust and economy. These are working, and our staff engagement is high, and we've got relatively low turnover. But we are looking at more ways to struggle to fix the problem of trying to do too much, kind of where all at once, which is, I think, really prevalent in the charity sector because we see so many problems that we want to fix. We're trying to bring in some more rigorous methodology around kind of pipelining our work, working in sprints on a fewer number of things, being better about identifying what problem we're trying to solve and kind of scaling and testing solutions. So we know that we're really backing the right initiatives that make the biggest impact. And we're hoping that that's going to help us be much more agile in such a volatile external environment. And then finally, we are considering our environmental impact too. This really matters because it's the right thing to do, but also climate change contributes directly to stroke incidence because there's a link between stroke and air pollution, and because there's a link between economic inequalities and stroke. We've committed to becoming a net zero organization by 2040. We're working at the moment to establish an emissions baseline, which we'll report against regularly. Our investments are linked to at least 5 times more carbon emissions than our energy use. So we are looking at moving away from the energy sector in our investment portfolio and replace it with sectors that have lower carbon intensity. We have a responsibility as an NHS contract holder to meet the requirements for net zero, and we've actually already seen local commissioners value that really much more highly than they have before in bids. We're doing our part, as I'm sure many of you are too, but we absolutely know that government action is going to be needed for us to truly meet our net zero commitment. So it's another kind of really a thing that really underlines the importance of us as a sector joining together to speak truth to power to make sure government action continues. And that's it from me. So thanks very much, and looking forward to hearing the rest of the speakers.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alexis. And just a reminder as well, if you've kind of got any questions that you'd like to put to kind of Rebecca, Alexis, or any of our kind of guest speakers today, do feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A. But on to our second guest speaker, and we're now handing over to Jack Bastian, the Chief Education Officer at Diversity Role Models. So Diversity Role Models actively seeks to embed inclusion and empathy in the next generation. And as a charity, their mission is to create an education system in which every young person will know they are valued and supported whoever they are. So to run through your reflections, Jack, it's over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Nick. And thank you, Rebecca, as well, for taking us through that brilliant report. Yeah, I think from our perspective, lots of what was mentioned in the report really resonated with our experience at Diversity Role Models. So really pleased to be able to share some of those reflections with you. Diversity Role Models is a charity that works with young people and with the adults around them to ensure that schools and colleges are places where difference is celebrated and that everyone can thrive. So we were set up back in 2011 by an openly gay teacher who saw the power of bringing in members of the LGBTQ+ community and allies as a powerful tool to embed empathy, challenge stereotypes, and get young people to reflect on the often unintended impact of prejudice, language, and bullying. So since our foundation, we have worked directly with over 200,000 young people. That's in primary schools, secondary schools, further education, alternative provision in London, in the Northwest, and in the Northeast of England as well. Alongside that, we've also trained over 25,000 members of school staff, and we're really proud as well to have been working with NCVO for a number of years on some of our evaluation work, on creating theories of change, on policy development, governance, and so we have NCVO as an independent evaluator on a large funded project as well. The first area that I wanted to cover was around the political aspects, and with the general election looming this year, I think the current political context in which we're operating as a charity remains quite challenging. Increasingly, we found that culture war issues are seen as a large electoral battleground, and this has made work that perhaps was previously seen as part of our statutory obligations appear more controversial in some quarters. So we work on equalities issues within schools, and in particular, we focus a lot of our work on LGBTQ+ inclusion in education. And that wider political context, we've seen lots of conversations happening there. So between 2009 and 2019, we saw a 400% increase in the amount of media reporting on trans issues in particular. And we've seen education as well unfold as a key terrain in which these culture wars are played out. And so with the election on the horizon, it's also provided uncertainty around statutory duties and non-statutory changes that are currently being discussed at government level. So, for example, the Department for Education are currently consulting on their draft non-statutory guidance on supporting gender questioning young people. And that we're not sure when the election will come in relation to the consultation closing, etc., being reviewed, and when that guidance will be out. I'd really encourage actually all relevant charities, particularly those who work with schools or with young people, to review that guidance carefully and respond to the consultation, which is open until March the 12th. Alongside that, there's also a review underway of the relationship, sex, and health education guidance, and a large focus on that. I think informed in part by some of the political conversations is around determining what is age appropriate in relation to relationships or sex education. That's become quite a contested political issue, and one that we might see becoming part of the discourse around the general election as well. So all of this leaves charities like ourselves, but also the wider education sector in a period of uncertainty around some of those statutory pieces of guidance and the national curriculum. We're also a recipient of a grant from the Department for Education to work on preventing prejudice-based bullying. And with the timings of the election and the purdah period as well, it raises questions in relation to renewal of those contracts. So similar challenges and questions there on what the future of certain forms of funding might be as well. So those political challenges, I think that the report highlighted really did resonate with us as an organisation. Similarly, as well, the economic and social factors and the current cost of living crisis in particular is a huge challenge that we're facing, as well as challenges that the public sector are facing is also impacting us as a charity. So we, as I said, support schools and colleges, which are vital public services, but they continue to face quite severe financial challenges. So I've worked in education for over a decade, and in that time, funding has remained a key challenge year on year. According to the Institute for Fiscal Studies and a report that they produced, school spending per pupil fell by 8.5% in real terms in England between 2009-10 and 2019-20. The IFS report also highlighted how school costs have outstripped inflation, with funding falling sharply as a percentage of GDP. And the National Education Union estimate that 92% of schools will be unable to cope with cost increases in 2024-2025 without making cuts to education provision. This means that 99% of secondary schools and 91% of primary schools will need to make cuts to survive. So that presents a huge challenge for charities like ourselves that work with schools. As a small charity, we've historically had to charge for our workshops and our training that we run in schools, and increasingly are finding that those institutions are struggling to pay for those external providers who supplement the core curriculum and provide training. Schools also are facing large amounts of pressure with a recruitment and retention crisis and a high staff turnover. There's also lots of challenges in securing cover in schools for teachers to coordinate activities like ours or attend CPD sessions. So engaging with teachers and with educators and with the workforce with such a high workload and a lack of flexibility can also present its challenges. As an organisation too, similarly to the Stroke Association, we've seen high inflation and increased costs, including things like travel, wages, and that hasn't always been matched by increases in grants, in particular grants that maybe grant agreements were signed up to 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago, and we haven't seen any changes in those despite inflation being where it has. So for us, it's meant that we've had to seek funding from other sources, including last year we fundraised to create a hardship fund so that those schools that maybe can't afford our work can still access our services. But working in a sector that has been in a sort of perpetual crisis, it has been challenging, and there continues to be challenges over the next year. And the last thing I wanted to pick up on as well was around one of the social aspects, which was around volunteering. So as a charity, we rely on our volunteers to give up their time, to share their personal story and their lived experience of bullying and difference in the classroom. And since the COVID-19 pandemic, we've certainly seen changes in working and living patterns. And as well, the cost of living crisis has made it harder for many to volunteer. So our volunteering usually takes place within the school day, and that's been harder for many to give time in the working day to volunteering. And there could also be changes to habits as well, brought on by the pandemic, changes in where people live. NCVO's Time Well Spent report in 2023 found that those organising or helping to run activities had halved from 14% to just 7%. And that echoes similar declines in fundraising activities and campaigning activities by volunteers as well. So as an organisation, as we move into 2024, we're looking to recruit ahead of volunteering to try and boost engagement, recruitment and retention of our volunteers as they remain central to us achieving our mission as an organisation. So in conclusion, I think the factors highlighted in the Road Ahead report have a very real impact on charities like ourselves and on the work that we do. And it remains vital that charities, big and small, understand these risks, but also work together to plan, adapt, share best practice so that collectively we can achieve our missions and make a tangible difference in the world. And back to you, Nick.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jack. It's great that you were able to kind of put some of the kind of predictions on the road ahead into the context of kind of what you're experiencing at Diversity Role Models. And that's really much appreciated. But on to our final kind of guest speaker for today. I'm pleased now kind of hand over to kind of Dan Such, who is the co-founder and director of CAST, who work with charities, funders, investors, and mission-driven organisations to help them use digital technologies to address big social challenges. In addition, NCVO are really fortunate to have him as one of our trustees as well. So for the final Road Ahead 2024 reflection, Dan, it's over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so very much. And thank you so much for the invitation to come and join you today. I have thoroughly enjoyed the conversation so far. I think having read the report, I would like to focus on the theme around adapting to change. Our sector often demonstrates just how well we adapt to change, the pandemic being the most obvious example that should absolutely be celebrated, but we're constantly changing in response to economic change, policy change, social change, environmental change. I think right now we really need to come to learn from how well we can adapt to change, because that feels like this is going to be something that's a constant reminder, a constant requirement to continually kind of respond to the changes in our external environment. And adapting, of course, is both a real challenge, but it's also an opportunity. As a charity ourselves, we spend lots of time working to understand how charities respond to the new opportunities around digital, or how digital technologies influence our communities and how we need to respond to those changes in behaviours. What we found is that organisations that are most adaptable to change are those that shorten the gap between sensing and responding. And what I mean by that is how quickly we can identify new challenges and new opportunities, and how quickly we can respond to that sense or those new insights. It's one of the reasons actually why this Road Ahead report is so important, because it's a really great example of kind of sensing what we might need to respond to, allowing conversations about them, and then forward planning to figure out how we best respond to these sorts of opportunities and challenges. Our opportunity here is to think, how do we constantly kind of sense more regularly to understand the changes in our communities, in those that we support, in the environment in which we're operating, and then figure out how we can respond better as organisations. So as a leader of a charity, the question that I'm constantly asking my team is like, how can we constantly sense, get feedback, find out from others, hear about changes? How can we make sense of those as a group? And how can we change that in the way in which we deliver new services or new responses? Now, it's really hard to do that when we're so time poor, resource poor, but trying to bring those processes or ways of working. So we're constantly looking outside our organizations, listening to peers, listening to our communities, and then figuring out how quickly we can respond. That feels like it's a hallmark or a key characteristic if our organizations and our sector is going to be able to respond and adapt to change. If I was going to take one very extreme example, I would look at something like Amazon, who make changes to their platform 125,000 times a day, trying to get people to put that other thing in a basket and to pay for it. They're responding to how people are behaving, their environment, and what's going on. I'm not suggesting for a moment we should be looking at changes 125,000 times a day, but how can we shorten the gap from when we're sensing new changes to testing out new ways of responding? That's the way in which we become more adaptable as organizations and hopefully create more value as organizations. Now, the reason that's so important right now is this explosion in what's called generative AI. And there's a phrase that is called once per decade disruptions. So every 10 years or so, the dominant model of computers changes from big mainframes that only 4 universities had, to PCs that sat on every office desk, to internet connected devices, to mobile phones. The way in which we engage with information with each other changes based on that dominant model of computing. And it's pretty certain that the biggest kind of once per decade disruption taking place right now is with generative AI. Now, the reason for thinking about that is it's not just how we change how we engage with computers. The dominant model of computing changes our and our community's expectations, our behaviors, and even how we think about problems and opportunities. I can give many examples from different sectors, but if we think about education as one, when we had a very few resources, the way in which we thought about education was by an expert sharing, broadcasting information and resources to as many people as possible. As we had technologies that allowed reproduction of content, we had more focus on writing and working together. As we have the internet, we have more kind of discovery and research. We have schools connected together. Today, we're coming together as a group, even though we're spread across the country because of internet technologies, the way in which we think about how we share and learn changes. So as this new once per decade disruption, generative AI, continues at such pace, it's going to change the expectations and behaviors of those we're working with. And it can change the expectations and behaviors of our teams too. The Charity Digital Skills Framework last year showed that 27% of charities are using AI within their work, just beginning to use them. We did run a survey that finished last month, which shows that 53% of charities are now using generative AI in some way or another in their organisation. As we think about this as a tool, one phrase with generative AI is that every organisation has unlimited interns. Unlimited interns. A tool that can create all sorts of content of video, text, adverts, policies, first level research, creating funding strategies, not just kind of expert ones, but ones that kind of pull all sorts of information from the internet and say, this is, as an intern would, this is my first example. I don't know about your expertise or your context, but here's my first offering. If every organisation has unlimited interns, what does that mean for our capacity? What does that mean where we invest in or how we build extra support for our teams to deliver in new ways? And what does it mean when volunteers or those who are supporting us are also engaging more with generated content? What does that mean for how we can demonstrate trust and people can understand the heart of our work? Now, generative AI is moving at such a pace and such a scale. The only way we'll really understand its role in our work is if we engage with it in safe experiments and safe kind of targeted ways. And because it's such a big change externally, it feels like the only way we're really going to understand its role within the charity sector is if we do that together. And perhaps that's a role for NCVO for conversations like this. We'll be able to adapt to the kind of huge change in technology landscape if we experiment and share our learning together. But there's another reason that charities have such an important role in thinking about that once per decade disruptions. Historically, charities often take the role of responding to the negative consequences of technologies. As those technologies change the workplace, change routes into employment, change the skills required for young people, change how we communicate, charities often there to kind of pick up pieces to support people back into employment, to help people who are being made redundant, to help them develop new skills, all those sorts of things. That means we're in a position to be that front line of sensing any negative consequences of this huge technology disruption. And we can only do that if we're constantly listening and sensing into our communities to understand the impact of AI on them, so that we can figure out how then to respond, whether that's working with NCVO and campaigning at national level, whether it's providing direct support. It feels like with such significant change coming from technology, with our need to kind of sense and respond, we can make sure that we're working together to constantly kind of sense, share that information, find discussions like this, and then respond collectively. So not only are we adapting to change individually as organisations, but we're doing it together as a sector. Thank you for the report today. It's been fascinating to read it. Looking forward to the discussion. Thanks for your time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan. And thank you to all of our kind of great kind of guest panelists today for kind of sharing your experiences, for sharing your kind of plans on how you're going to tackle and approach the issues raised in the road ahead this year. And I think kind of giving everyone kind of lots more kind of food for thought as well. But for now, we're able to move on to our Q&A. So we've kind of heard a headline summary from Rebecca on the road ahead. We've heard reflections from Alexis, Dan and Jack and how they see the predictions impacting their work or affecting the voluntary sector more broadly. But now it's time to answer some of the questions that you've been submitting kind of through the Q&A. So I can now hand back to Rebecca, who's going to chair the next kind of 20 minutes for the Q&A, with our colleague Sam from our policy team joining Alexis, Dan and Jack, and I'll stop sharing my slides as well so that we can see everyone on screen.
Thanks, Nick. So I think first I'll go to Alexis, and I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what are the other benefits you offer your employees other than flexible working?
Yeah, of course. I mean, flexible working is one of the main ones, and we've gone much farther than we kind of, I think a lot of other charities are going on that. We kind of have a policy called making your week work for you. So there's no need to submit a kind of formal request to work flexibly. So you kind of, your hours are yours to kind of work across the week, however you so see fit. So we do a pension and salary exchange. And actually we have just recommended to the Board of Trustees that we pass on the employer benefit of salary exchange onto the employee. We've got financial well-being loans. We do obviously home working and mileage allowance at the highest rate we can. We do enhanced maternity and paternity leave. We've got paid dependent leave. We're a real living wage employer. We do professional development bursaries. We've got an employee assistance program that has a kind of health cash plan with Westfield Health, and we offer a kind of GP line that is really handy if you need a GP appointment quickly. And also we offer counselling sessions to every member of staff. So I think you get on average 6 per year as standard, which has been really helpful. And then we also have gone much farther in terms of flexibility of holiday entitlement. So we now, we don't require people to take bank holidays on the actual bank holidays. That's included in your annual leave allowance, so that if you're not kind of wanting to take things at holidays that fall in normal kind of Christian calendar, you can take them at different times, just increases that flexibility. Your holiday entitlement increases with your length of service. And then on anniversary years, so I think it's 5, 10, and 15, might not be 5 actually, 10 and 15 years service, you get an extra kind of 5 or 10 days holiday for that year, in addition to a small, like a letter from the chief exec and a gift card to spend wherever you wish. And then we have some other deals that we do to make kind of shopping cheaper. So we've got some plans around that. And then we also have negotiated for our staff, because we're an NHS contractor, a blue light card, which is fantastic in terms of discounts. So that's just a few, but yeah, I think that's enough for now, but very happy to talk in more detail to anyone who's interested.
Thanks so much, Alexis. We'll all be applying for jobs at your organisation. Dan, I wonder if I could come to you just on the environmental impact of generative AI, and also any thoughts on kind of different ways in which charities might be using AI.
Yeah, so the environmental question is huge. Searching for something using generative AI uses about 100 times the amount of power that it does just doing a Google search. It's really, really significant. So there's a whole set community of organizations who are trying to address that, either from lobbying, trying to figure out from a technical perspective how you can decrease the carbon footprint, all sorts of work going on. So it's a very big issue. I guess there are two things I would qualify around that. The first is we did a little bit of analysis last year looking at funding going into charities' use of digital. And it's less than 1/3 of 1% of the amount of money that's going into generative AI. So to cover all of our charities' expertise and kind of work around exploring digital, less than 1/3 of 1%. So there's definitely a focus on like how do we think about our use of generative AI carefully and thoughtfully? How do we think about the environmental implications? There's also how do we quickly develop our skills and understanding of these tools so that we can create a stronger sense of lobbying beyond our sector? Because the people who are using this and generating new technologies are outside our sector at the moment, and we need to be influencing them. That's the first. Then jumping into the question about how it's being used, it's a really wide range. We're looking at AI. So lots of AI that we'll be using are things like just making kind of internal processes a bit more effective. People are using generative AI in slightly different ways, though, which is trying to think about how do you create that first draft of anything, whether that's a video or copy for a blog or even internal policies. I did a board paper where 70% of it was AI generated. I told them, and I think it's important that we are really clear where we're using AI in our work. But that paper, I set aside about half a day to write that paper for the board, and it took me 30 minutes. So what we're then doing is saying that if we can save that kind of amount of time, how do we redeploy my time in a way that really serves our mission? So, but there are hundreds of ways in which charities are using AI, from generating content, from trying to engage with new donors, celebrating their work. But the model I have right now is that if you have unlimited interns in your organization, so these are people who, this is a tool that doesn't have your expertise or your sector knowledge, but it's an intern that's wanting to help you. How can that help you be more specific in the work that you want to do and add value on top of that work?
Thanks so much, Dan. I should also say we'll be keeping a note of things in the chat and also the questions coming through. And that's really useful for us at NCVO to think about what support members across our organisation need. There's a question that's come through about volunteering. And Jack, I wondered if you'd be able to say a little bit more about how you're thinking about adapting your volunteering offer or grappling with some of those challenges.
Yeah, I think it's it's presented itself as quite a challenge. So we have around 300 volunteers that support our work in schools. One of the ways that we're looking to adapt it is looking at trying to think about how we might create more of a community amongst those volunteers. So we might have already a good coverage of volunteers, but how often are those people feeling that they were able to volunteer? Are they feeling connected to the organization? Are they feeling like they're adequately supported, trained, etc.? Are they getting something from the relationship as well? So we're certainly putting a lot of thought into kind of continued education for volunteers, looking as well at how we might create more sense of community because it's often going into a school that is, you'll be with a small team of people and everybody goes off their own way home and you might not get to see people that often. So trying to build in more opportunities for that connection, also using technology to connect people as well, having things like the ability to do online meetings, drop-ins, etc. And also that can allow for greater flexibility as well. If we've got volunteers who are based in a completely different part of the country to where the school is, we can adapt and we can use some of the technologies like Zoom, etc., to be able to get people to volunteer and share their stories in that way. So it's something that we're putting quite a bit of thought into, in that. And within the Road Ahead report, that idea around flexibility was quite important, and thinking about how we might make ourselves more flexible in order to allow people to volunteer, and as well thinking about their volunteering experience, making sure that it is something that is enriching for them, so that they can be really valuing that experience as well as the value that we get from their time and their expertise working with young people.
Thanks so much, Jack. I thought I'd just quickly pick up some of the questions that have come through about campaigning. So I think I just want to emphasise that there is a lot that charities can do within the rules, and I'd really encourage organisations to take a look at the guidance that we put on our website. I don't think we'll be able to kind of do it justice today in the time we have, but also keep a lookout for webinars that we'll be running a little bit later in the year, that will help you to understand what you can do within the sort of rules and regulations. I wondered actually if I could come to each one of the panel members about something you're excited about for the year ahead. It's all been a little bit bleak so far.
I don't mind first, if that's
yes,
okay.
Great, thanks, Alexa.
So yeah, I mean, the external environment is particularly bleak. I really resonated with what you said, Dan, around kind of sensing and responding. And so I think the thing that I'm most interested and enthusiastic about is actually the internal ways of working that we're trying to bring into the Stroke Association. So trying to fundamentally bring in more sensing and responding, really trying to do a smaller number of things much quicker than we have before, rather than trying to kind of plan out for the entire year. We actually don't have an annual plan this year for the first time. We're planning on 6-week schedules, and that's terrifying, but also really exciting because it's complete new ways of working. It's really stress testing our mental models about what work is and how you do it, how you kind of effectively engage with the external environment. So hopefully that will help us really up our impact, because we want to be seeing us making much more quick inroads towards our goals, such as being able to be there for every new stroke survivor. So that's what I'm most excited about at the moment.
Thanks, Alexa.
I can jump in on mine if you like, which is one that I didn't realize I was excited about until hearing Dan's presentation, but the unlimited interns is definitely really exciting, with that idea of how we might harness some of these technological developments that are quite unique in this kind of once in a generation opportunity, and how charities can work together to share best practice on that and get the most from some of these technological developments is something I'm excited about.
Yeah, I want to echo that. I wrote the economic section of the Road Ahead, so that's kind of my bag. I'm not really up to date with technological developments, but I really want to be, particularly after reading the Road Ahead and particularly after hearing Dan's presentation. I think that the time that we set aside now to really understand what the possibilities are for our specific organizations and our specific roles will be paid back kind of 10, 20, 30 fold in the productivity gains that we're able to make, but also just kind of the headspace that we're able to free up. I'm sure everybody on this webinar can kind of relate to that feeling of just kind of constantly moving from one crisis to the next, one topic to the next, and not really having that just kind of time to think. And so I'm really excited about the potential for AI to free up a lot more time to kind of invest in our own headspace in the sector.
I'm just going to jump on the technology bandwagon, but for a reason. So the task we have within the CAST team is how can we find 20% efficiencies in our day? And that's not, the aspiration is quite important, because it's that scale. We're not looking for kind of 1% and 2% changes. It's like, let's look for the big things we do repetitively that we can save significant amounts of time. And if we save that time, how does that help us spend more time with our families and our communities, all focused on our mission? And that's, for me, is really exciting that there's, we're at the start of an incredible technological kind of phase where we can think about how do we harness that to help achieve our missions better. And I think because it's the other thing that kind of comes for me that I'm so excited by being an optimist is I think where we see charities really adapting to change, it's where we do things together. And we've got a chance now to share our learning about where we're saving time, how we're kind of making progress, share it so we're all benefiting from it. And then ultimately we'll have a stronger view beyond our sector, stronger influence about how we ensure that our values are at the heart of this technology revolution.
Thanks so much, everyone, for those reflections. I think maybe we should end it on a positive note. So I think I'll wrap up the Q&A section there, and I'll pass back to Nick.
Great, thank you, Rebecca, and obviously again kind of thank you to all of our kind of panel members for kind of fielding all of those kind of questions as well. Before we go, I just wanted to signpost to some tools, resources and further support which are listed on this slide kind of right now. So first up, on our support for small charities and voluntary organisations website pages, you'll find links to our online help and guidance, including our free and our member-only content on campaigning, the cost of giving crisis, collaboration, governance, digital technology, and so much more. Here, you'll also find details of how to contact our small charity help desk and a link to sign up to our practical support bulletin if you haven't done so already. We've also got a huge range of free webinars in February and March, so kind of very much on the horizon. We've got a webinar on what it's called Donor Love Actually, exploring how to build successful fundraising relationships. We've got a briefing on the Big Help Out 2024 and how you can get involved in that. We've got a webinar offering an introduction to crisis communications. And then finally, we've got a follow-up Road Ahead webinar with Sage Intact on the 26th of March, looking in more depth at the economic, social and tech areas of the road ahead. Bookings for that webinar will open on our event pages early next week. Finally, NCVO has a huge online training programme with courses running each and every month where NCVO members receive a 30% discount. If you're not yet a member of NCVO, we would love to have you join our community of over 17,000 organisations, from the biggest help-to-name charities to the smallest community groups. Membership is free to organisations with an income of under 30,000. This slide lists the 5 key areas of support that we can help you with, which include governance, volunteering, HR, strategy and funding. Our members really are at the heart of everything that we do, and we exist to make your lives that little bit easier so that you can focus on the things that really matter and make the greatest impact to the communities that you serve. More information about becoming a member can be found on the NCVO website. So before we go, a snap poll is about to appear on your screen any second now, just to get your initial thoughts on how you found today's launch event. If you've got time as well, as you leave the session, you'll find a feedback survey on your browser, and we'd really value your reflections on the things you enjoyed, where we could make improvements, where we could offer you more support to help us deliver better events in the future. But that's it. That concludes today's event and the launch of the Road Ahead 2024. The full publication is now available via the NCVO website. Only time will tell which of our predictions will have the biggest impact on the voluntary sector. But no matter what hurdles come our way or what opportunities emerge over the course of the next 12 months, NCVO will be here to offer you the support and the guidance that you need every step of the way. But before we sign off, on behalf of my colleagues and at NCVO, I'd like to give special thanks to Alexis, Jack and Dan for their contributions to the event today. And a huge thank you to you for joining us. It's been great to have had so many of you here for the launch of this year's Road Ahead, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.